Hello everyone, welcome to a new video. So in this video we're going to address image sharpness on the Sigma Contemporary 150-600 on an EF Canon mount. So we're testing it on the EOS R full frame mirrorless camera, and we're also testing it on the 90D APS-C camera. So we want to have a look at image sharpness and quality, especially in the corners, to see how sharp this lens is. Now, I will be using two focal lengths in this video, which will be 500mm and 600mm, because that's essentially where these lenses are going to be used at. Just so you know, on APS-C cameras, you're going to get 800mm at 500, and at 600mm you're going to get 960mm. Just remember, APS-C you're always timesing your focal length by 1.6 to give you your true magnification focal length. So without further ado, let's have a look at the lens sharpness test card. It's a pretty decent card to assess sharpness. I think the exposure was a little bit off, if I'm honest with you. We're using ISO 500. I've done this on a tripod with a 10-second timer on each camera, and I've tried to frame the 90D equivalent to the full frame by moving the tripod and camera and lens back a bit, and hopefully it'll give you a reasonable representation on sharpness. So without further ado, let's zoom into these images and let's see the image sharpness quality at f6.3 on full frame. These are the EOS R images we will look at first. So let's just zoom in there into the center. As I've said, ISO is 500. I think at 6.3 is reasonable. I wouldn't say it's super sharp. Let's have a look in the corner. What I'm looking at is these rectangular boxes. They will give us an indication on sharpness, because there is a fine pattern in there that may not be represented in the image. So let's have a look. So zoom in there at 100%. Now already you can see it's not quite sharp. So what I'm seeing here is we're getting some blurriness here. A little bit of detail is appearing in this box here, and as we get to here, more moving towards the center, we are seeing a pattern. If you can see there is a little pattern there that you can see. But it looks reasonable. I won't say it's super sharp, but these lenses are going to be sharper in the center, obviously. And this is at 500mm. So the next image is at f8. Let's have a look and see how that's doing. So let's zoom into the center again. It looks quite reasonable. It does seem to be a slight improvement in sharpness. Let's move over to the corner and let's have a look and see how we're doing in terms of sharpness. So what I can say is there is some development of the pattern in the far corner here. While it does look blurry, you can see there's a pattern developing, and obviously there's more of a pattern that we didn't have in the 6.3. We move over to the 6.3, you can see we've got blurriness there. We go to f8 and you can see the pattern is more defined there, so obviously we're getting more in focus. So let's have a look at f16. So f16, obviously it's a darker aperture as well. I do think that some diffraction is coming into effect at f16, which does have an effect of softening the image, but I don't think it's major, not at f16. So looking at the center, it looks pretty good. That's at 50%, that's at 66%, that's at 100%, so it looks pretty good. So let's move over. Obviously we've got some good sharpness there in the patterns. You can see patterns here. And let's move over to the box again here. As you can see, it's more defined at f16. We can see already that we've got good detail here in the far corner, and obviously more detail as we go along. But let's zoom in there into 200%. There is a bit of blurriness. It's very minor. You can't really see it too much there. And it's a lot better over here in terms of the detail. We go back to f8, you can see we've got some blurriness here, and then we go to f16 and that blurriness has cleared up. So we're having a good result there with the Sigma Contemporary lens, I think, on full frame. So let's jump into the examples at 600mm now at f6.3. So let's have a look in more detail. Again, I've said the ISO is at 500 if you're wondering. We are using long shutter speeds. I think they range from 1/8 of a second to 1/16 of a second. So that's why we're using a tripod and a 10-second timer on the cameras. Looking at this, there's good detail. You can see good pattern detail. People have said that at 500mm it's going to be sharper than at 600, but I'm finding that to be opposite here. But let's have a look at f6.3, where if we just jump to the 500mm at f6.3, we've got a lot of blurriness there. But as soon as we go to 600mm, we've got a bit more detail. So it seems to be doing better at 600mm than it was at 500. But at 6.3, we're getting good detail here. Obviously, you can see the pattern here, and obviously, you know, moving over, you've got good detail pattern here as well. Looks pretty good. You know, you can even see some hairs on here that's actually on leftover from when I had a dog. And obviously hairs get everywhere, as you know, so we can see there's good detail here. Let's move over to f8 and let's see how we're doing there. So in the center again, looks reasonable, very sharp in my opinion. It's not super tack sharp, but you've got to remember these lenses are a lot cheaper than any expensive prime is. Moving over here, we can clearly see that we've got some good detail there. Let's just remind ourselves what our details are in terms of the aperture. So at f8 at 600mm, so it looks reasonable and pretty sharp, no major problems there. So let's have a quick look at f16 at 600mm. So looking in the center again, nice detail, looks a tiny bit sharper. Over here we can see good sharpness. In the patterns here you can see good detail. But where I want to look at is here, and I think we're getting excellent detail actually at f16. If we go back to f8 and compare that, and then back to f16, we're getting more detail, as you can see. So I do like the performance that this lens is giving us, and I do think it's quite good actually. And I will be addressing the Tamron 150 to 600 G2 in a separate video. We'll look at that in more detail, and that will be coming very shortly. But I do want to say that at 600mm at f16 he's doing a reasonable good job. So let's move over. Let's just double check my facts because I'm sometimes forgetful. So we're at 500mm on the 90D, which, if my maths, translates to 800mm on APS-C. So this is an APS-C camera. This is f6.3. Let's have a look how we're doing in the center. So at 100%, it doesn't look too sharp, but I tend to find that with f6.3, it's not too fantastically sharp. There is some detail. You can see, make out some pattern, but it's not great. And then if we start looking here, it's blurry in the far corner here. Obviously we're using more of the central part of the lens, but even APS-C with the pixels crammed into the actual APS-C sensor is very taxing on full frame lenses in terms of image quality, and you quite often have to stop them down to get good results. So let's have a look at f8 at 500mm, or equivalent of 800mm at APS-C. So let's have a look in the center first of all. Looks reasonable at f8. That looks okay. There's some detail coming through. It's a tiny bit sharper, but not vastly. Let's have a look here and see how we're doing. Don't seem to see much detail. Either it's me, or I think APS-C is struggling here at f8, and don't know if there's an issue here with diffraction coming into effect and softening the images, but believe it or not, I'm seeing better detail at f6.3 than I am at f8. That's a bit unusual. I was using a 10-second timer, so I don't know what's going on there. It should, in theory, be sharper, but it's not quite. Let's have a look at f16. It's always possible there's a tiny bit of camera shake because we was using long shutter speeds. So let's go into the center f16 at 500mm, equivalent to 800mm. Let's zoom in there. Okay, it's not fantastic if I'm honest with you. You can obviously see that at 100% there. Moving over. The hairs that we was seeing in the full frame images are not that clear here. You can't make them out here. So obviously it's clearly better on full frame than it is on APS-C. Let's move over again. The patterns I'm not seeing here. Let's have a look at the patterns here. There's no patterns at all. So to be honest with you, on APS-C's f6.3 seems better. That's the 6.3 image, I think. At 500mm. So what I'm seeing here is there's some pattern detail there. At f8 I'm seeing no pattern detail here in the corners, and f16 again there's no pattern detail. So it does suggest that we're getting softness at f8 and f16, which is very surprising. Did not expect that. So let's have a look at 600mm. Now if I have the correct maths, on APS-C that will work out at 960mm. So let's jump to the images at 600 on the lens. So let's have a look at detail in the center. We're a bit more zoomed in obviously. So let's have a look. I think it's a similar story to what it is at 500mm. It's not fantastically sharp. It does seem to be a bit more detail because we can make out some hairs here. So it's possible at 600mm this lens is performing better than it does at 500. So let's have a look a bit more in the corners because that's where the lens tends to obviously struggle. There is a bit of pattern detail here as I couldn't see before. Let's have a look at f6.3. Obviously it is blurry. I'm not going to underestimate that and understate that. But we are seeing some of the pattern in these boxes. So obviously that's at f6.3. Let's have a look at f8. Zoom into the center and have a look at the sharpness there. Obviously it's not greatly sharp. If we move over here a little bit, those hairs we was seeing on there are not very clear. Let's move a bit down. Obviously the pattern there doesn't seem to be any sort of improvement, if I'm honest with you. Let's zoom in here to a 200%. We are noticing some pattern there obviously. Let's go back to f6.3, see if there's any difference. f8, 6.3, f8. There's a tiny amount of improvement, not much. So let's have a look at f16 finally. Let's look at the center, see how it's looking. It's looking more or less the same. Don't see any major improvement. Same again with the hairs on that center part there. There isn't any sort of detail that I'm seeing. I think we've lost. Yeah, I think diffraction is coming into effect here because I've seen no detail on these rings at all, where we was seeing some. If we just move over here, as you can see there is some detail. You've got some pattern there, but at f16, even at 100%, you know, zoom in a bit more, it's blown. You know, you can't see any detail there. So I would say at f16 we're getting diffraction for definite. Let's just move over here into the corner where I was looking at, and even the ones look blurry. Compare that to the f8 image, it just looks better. Go to 6.3. So here we have the comparison, obviously. 6.3 at 600mm, ISO 500, equivalent to 996mm. And that's f6.3. That's f8. That's f16. So to me, f16 is a lot worse. So if we go back to f16 at 500mm on APS-C, that's f8, 6.3. So it's a bit of a mixed bag really, where I think f8 improves the image slightly at 600mm. Either I've got a bit of camera shake going off, or it seems to be better at f6.3 at 500mm, which is quite unusual. Normally when you stop it down it should get better, but it seems to have introduced a little bit of diffraction at 500, which is unusual. Very strange. But if we go back to our full frame image there at 6.3, obviously the detail there there's a little bit but not much. f8 improves it dramatically. Obviously you can see some patterns developing, and obviously at f16 it's even better. And if you'd like to see about center sharpness, you can have a look here. That's at f6.3. Again, if we move over to f8 here, and again at f16 on the EOS R full frame. So that's f16, that's f8, and that's 6.3. Seems to get a little bit blurry at 6.3 in the center, if I'm honest with you. So I hope this was informative. You know, essentially it does better on full frame than it does on APS-C, clearly. So you want to really stop this lens and keep it down to f8 if you can. Certainly at 600mm. So hopefully this video was informative. You know, I'll bring you another video on the Tamron 150 to 600 G2 lens shortly. Hopefully that'll be informative as well. Thanks for watching, and check out the other videos that I've been looking at in terms of the autofocus performance, because I do think the Tamron is a little slower than the Sigma in terms of autofocus performance, especially on mirrorless cameras. I don't think you'll notice the difference on digital SLRs that use a mirror to focus, because it's a different type of focusing system. I think if you're going to rely on live view, you'll find there will be a significant difference, however, because I'll notice when I used the 90D with live view it was quite slow to focus, but when I used the separate focusing system, which is using the mirror, focus was quick, and on both lenses, you know, focus was quick on the 150 to 600 Sigma and Tamron lenses. But when the mirrorless cameras got involved, the EOS R, I noticed focus was significantly slower on the Tamron versus the Sigma. So I hope this video informed you a little bit on image quality. We'll look at another video shortly. We'll produce one for the Tamron lens. And thank you for watching, and I hope this was informative. Like everything, I hope you learned something today, and I'll see you later in another video.